Hi guys, it's Catherine. So today I wanted to talk about The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, which was published last year and was longlisted this year for the Man Booker Prize. And it's one of the novels out of this long list that I'd heard most praise about, so it's the first one that I've read. I'm not planning on reading all the books that are longlisted for the Man Booker this year, because not all of them interest me, but there are a fair few that I think sound really interesting, so I will be reading as many as I can, and I will obviously be sharing my thoughts with you guys, because I'm sure a lot of you are also reading them around this time as well. So firstly, the book's title. It's derived from a real connection of safe houses and secret routes around the United States that were used in the first half of the 1800s by black slaves who were trying to escape from slavery into free states and Canada, and they were aided in this Underground Railroad by white abolitionists and also former black slaves. In reality, this was of course not a real railroad, it's more of a figurative term, and it's underground, not because it's literally underground, but because it was outlawed. But in this novel, Colson Whitehead makes it into a real underground railroad, which added a really interesting aspect to the novel. It allows the action to move much more quickly between states and different areas of the US in a way that slaves couldn't do in actuality, so it allows a much broader scope in the novel. I studied slavery very briefly in school, and this aspect of it was never discussed, so to be honest I didn't know a great deal about it until I was sort of researching this novel before I read it. I think when you're trying to teach a classroom of children the basics of slavery, it's very easy to make it quite literally black and white, where white people are exclusively the malevolent enslavers and black people are their helpless victims. Of course, the truth is a lot more complex than this, and the Underground Railroad shows that there was an element of coordination and cooperation between both classes and race. This book confronts the brutality of many slave owners head-on, and it really depicts the relentless violence that many slaves were subjected to, but it doesn't do this to make you pity the slaves, but rather to acknowledge the courage that it took them to even attempt to escape when they knew their lives were in danger for even trying. I think the idea that this novel explores in most detail is liberty in its many forms, and every year the slaves on the cotton plantation. I think the idea that this novel explores most in depth is liberty in its many forms, and the slaves on the cotton plantation were allowed to celebrate the birthday of the oldest slave every year, and it says, "The white men were silent, as if they'd given up or decided that a small freedom was the worst punishment of all, presenting the bounty of true freedom into painful relief." These small liberties were not really a triumph on the slaves' part, but highlighted their wider lack of autonomy. The main character in this novel, Cora, struggles relentlessly to achieve freedom, both in the physical sense of being free from slavery, but also in the more psychological sense of being free from the prejudice that she faces on a daily basis. It's not exactly a revelation to say that a novel about slavery has strong themes of liberty and freedom, but it is one of the aspects that I enjoyed most about this novel. I'm in the privileged position to have never had to seek liberty. I have always had my autonomy and my human rights, and generally I'm respected as an equal to others. My liberty has never been under threat, and so this novel was a really sobering insight into how it feels to be owned, and the lengths that the human spirit will go to escape from this. This book is very nuanced in the tension not only between the slavers and the enslaved, but between the slaves themselves. And I think it's understandable when you have so little that any tiny thing that you do own becomes of massive importance. For example, Cora's little 2-square-foot plot of land which she defends viciously. I think in some media depictions of slavery there's a tendency to romanticise their plight, to view them as a united community bound together in their hatred for their white enslavers, and in some ways this homogenises them. And although they do all fight for freedom, they differ greatly in their smaller objectives and their opinions, and they have conflicts, and this novel realistically depicts all of this. This novel is very wide-reaching, and it represents the different forms of oppression in many states across the US. While the novel does focus in on the experiences of one slave girl, Cora, in her attempts to find freedom, there are also chapters from the perspective of other characters, including white characters who in some way or other do contribute towards the oppression of black people, and I found it really interesting to see from their perspective how they could possibly rationalise their behaviour. There's so much in the way of fictional depictions of slavery, whether in TV, film or books, and I think it was a big challenge for Colson Whitehead to form a story here that felt unique and didn't feel rehashed. In my opinion, he succeeded because he managed to balance the book between being personal and also allegorical. The story is undoubtedly Cora's, but it also depicts the sometimes subtle and sometimes vastly different race relations across the United States, and in that way I found it quite unique. I've watched and read other depictions of slavery which I think have been more emotionally affecting to me, and in some ways I think this book does have a bit of a distancing effect, in that you see Cora's experiences and the horrors she encounters, but at a slight remove. And I think this just shows her way of dealing with things is to try and keep herself away from her emotional response. But in some ways I think this is actually really effective because the matter-of-fact nature in which things are described can sometimes make them seem even more horrifying. I feel like I can't comment too much about whether this book is deserving of the Man Booker Prize because I've only read one other of the long-listed books so far, Solar Bones, and even between these two books it is really impossible to say which is more deserving of an accolade like this because they are two vastly different novels. If the Man Booker Prize is an award for socially important and thought-provoking novels, then this is absolutely deserving. I don't think there's ever a time where it's not important for us to understand the history of racism, but I think particularly it's pertinent nowadays to understand the horrors of our past to try and prevent them from ever happening again. However, in terms of innovation of style or language, I'd say this book is much less deserving. I don't think it pushes the boundary of literature or the form of the novel in any particular way, and the writing style itself is quite simple and straightforward. I think it relies heavily on the content of the novel to achieve its desired effect on the reader. But again, this isn't necessarily what defines a Man Booker Prize winner, so I would be really neither disappointed nor surprised to see it on the shortlist, and I did think it was a really brilliant book. I'm going to make a video about Solar Bones shortly as well, because it's the other Man Booker longlisted book that I've read so far, but I'd really like to hear your recommendations for other books in the longlist, any ones that you've particularly liked, because I am looking to read a few more of them in the next couple of weeks. And of course I'd love to hear your thoughts on this book if you've read it already or if you're planning on reading it, but I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!